Okay, let's look at another principle of Leibniz, the principle of sufficient reasoning. Now, it's really important as we kind of unfold Leibniz ideas and arguments here that we keep in mind that, like Descartes, he believes he has already proven with 100% certainty that an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God has to exist as the divine creator of all. He believes that through reasoning, he has shown that it would be logically impossible for such a God not to exist. So then he says, okay, so if this being exists, this divine creator of all things, what else would have to be true? One thing Leibniz says is that, well, anything that exists for a reason. And it exists as it does for a reason. So God intended for all of the things that exist to exist. It was his will, Leibniz says. I might not understand his reasoning. I might not understand. Maybe sometimes God's playing a joke, right? He thinks to himself, hey, you know what would be really kind of a great cosmic joke? I'm going to create this philosophy professor who has this sweet beard, but I'm also going to make him bald, because that'll be hilarious, right? So maybe some things are just God's cosmic jokes, like me. Or maybe they serve some really important purpose in some moral event. But whatever exists was caused to exist by God. And it's important to remember that this God is an all-knowing God, which means this God could know all things that were knowable. And according to Leibniz, that included the ability to see all of the possibilities at the moment of creation. In fact, he would talk about them as all the possible worlds that could be brought into existence. And God would have seen all of those possibilities and then chosen from those possibilities and chosen what to create and how to create it. And Leibniz will go on to argue that he chose those things because they resulted in the best of all possible worlds. And Leibniz believed that because this is a God that makes no mistakes and leaves nothing to chance. He's a perfect being, so he probably couldn't leave anything to chance. And because he's a perfect being and all-powerful, it means he can create what he wants as long as it's creatable. So God decides what's going to exist, how it's going to exist, and he doesn't make any mistakes. So then Leibniz says you come across a question like, why is the sky on Earth blue? And Leibniz would say something like, well, because that's the way God made it. At the moment of creation, God looked out and saw there was a world where the sky on Earth was blue. There was a world where the sky on Earth was brown or pink or yellow or red. And for whatever reason, God knew that the best of all possible worlds was the world where Earth had a blue sky and Mars had a pink sky. Okay, you could even extend this down to just little events. John's talking to his philosophy class about Leibniz right now because God made the world in a way that requires John to be talking to the philosophy class about Leibniz right now. In other words, God saw all the possibilities. Some of those worlds included me talking to you about philosophy. Some of them didn't. And for reasons that are obvious to me, he chose the world where I am having this conversation with you because that was the world that God wanted. All right, so what does all this mean? Well, remember the first principle, the principle of identity. Leibniz says there are some kinds of statements that we call analytic statements that can't be false. They have to be true by either the rules of logic or definitions. But there are these other kinds of statements called synthetic statements. And those are statements that can be true, can be false. It just kind of depends on the way that things are. We would call these contingent statements. The statements like the cat is on the mat. Sometimes that statement's true, sometimes that statement's false. It just depends on whether or not there's actually a cat on the mat the moment we make that statement. All right, so then Leibniz says, okay, so keep these two types of statements in mind. One type of statement is a statement that has to always be true, can't be false. And the other type of statement is one that's contingent, could be true, could be false. And now think about, I'm not even going to try to pronounce this, but subspecies, who knows. But what it means is consider it from God's point of view. Okay, so take everything we've talked about so far and now play God. If God is omniscient, in other words, he's all-knowing and everywhere at all times, and all-powerful or omnipotent, and he's morally perfect and has a plan, then those synthetic propositions are also necessarily true from God's point of view. Okay, so try to track this. This is what he's saying. You go back and you look at these different types of statements. All bachelors are men. 2 + 3 = 5. These are statements that by logical necessity have to be true. They can't be false. These statements, on the other hand, are statements that can be true, can be false. And what Leibniz is saying is, but look, God's all-powerful and all-knowing. So these propositions have to be true because God declared them to be true. It's all part of God's plan. Okay? So what this means is that just like 2 plus 3 equals 5 is necessarily true, so is Biden as the president of the United States. It can't be any other way, because this all-knowing, morally perfect, all-powerful God made the universe unfold in the way that it has and the events in it to occur, because that God determined that this is what was required for the best of all possible worlds to exist. It couldn't have been any other way for this God, because this God would have had to settle for a less than best world. And because it's a morally perfect God, it wouldn't have settled for that. So the statements that you and I regard as contingent, these are statements that, in other words, statements that we think are sometimes true and sometimes false. From God's point of view, they couldn't be false. They have to be true because it's what God created and what God willed. All right? So think now about how Leibniz is taking these first two principles, the principle of identity and the principle of sufficient reason, and starting to create a kind of metaphysical picture about why the universe exists as it does. And that's what we'll look at in the very next lecture.